All right, let's just jump right into this explainer and tackle one of the most wild contradictions in the modern world. We're looking at a single geographic location that somehow manages to capture the absolute extremes of the human experience. I'm talking about Skid Row, located right in the heart of downtown Los Angeles. We're going to really unpack the reality of this 50-block neighborhood, looking directly at the data, the firsthand accounts, and the fiercely opposing viewpoints to understand exactly how a crisis of this sheer magnitude exists today. Think about California for a second. If it were its own independent country, it would be the fourth largest economy on the entire planet. We're talking about a GDP soaring over $3 trillion. It even passed Japan recently. But then you take a short walk from the glitz of Hollywood and massive corporate wealth, you cross an invisible line, and it's like stepping into a totally different universe. Over 6,000 human beings are living in tents, right on the sidewalks, in absolute destitution. It's almost as if the second you cross that line, the economic rules of gravity completely vanish.
So here's our game plan for how we're going to structure this analysis. We'll start by weighing the state's wealth against this extreme poverty, then look at the actual faces of the crisis. After that, we'll debate the root causes, take a look inside the relief organizations doing the heavy lifting, and finally ask, is this a crisis without end? We're going to zoom in and out to unpack this methodically, totally neutrally, just to understand exactly what is happening on the ground.
Okay, Section 1, Wealth versus Extreme Poverty. We're starting out at the macro scale.
Now, the state of California certainly hasn't ignored this crisis. In fact, since 2021, they've poured literally billions of taxpayer dollars into trying to fix it. But, and this is a huge but highlighted by observers on the ground, the accountability is incredibly fractured. All that money just flows into this massive web of nonprofits and city programs. Trying to track exactly where those billions end up or measure if they're actually working, it's proven nearly impossible. It raises a massive question about efficiency.
So, what's causing the systemic leaks at the very top? When analysts look at the broader societal structure, they point to a few massive macro-level failures driving this divide. First off, you've got a highly competitive capitalist economy that can easily isolate its most vulnerable members. Throw in the lack of a free, comprehensive, universal healthcare system to catch the people falling through the cracks, and pair that with deeply unfair housing policies in a fiercely expensive real estate market. It just creates this relentless cycle, proving that sheer wealth alone doesn't automatically protect people.
Moving on to Section 2, the faces of the crisis. Let's zoom right in on those 50 blocks.
You know, it's incredibly easy to walk past an encampment and just make broad assumptions. But the people living in these 6,000 tents are definitely not a monolith. They represent a really diverse cross-section of societal breakdown. We're talking about military veterans who just never got adequate post-war support. You have ex-convicts who served their time but literally have nowhere to return to. They're everyday workers who lost jobs, got buried in debt, and were suddenly evicted. Plus, people battling severe mental illness who are completely abandoned by the medical system, and of course, a massive population fighting profound drug addiction.
To really put a human face on these numbers, consider the unexpected presence of families caught up in this web. One report highlighted a Venezuelan migrant family living right in the middle of this chaos. They survived the insane, perilous trek through the jungle in Mexico, just searching for an economic future for their kids. They have work permits. They desperately just want to work. Yet they find themselves trapped on Skid Row, terrified of deportation, surrounded by an environment they never could have anticipated. It really challenges the stereotype of who is actually out on these streets.
Then you have folks like Catherine. Catherine has been living outside for 15 months. And the really crucial takeaway from her story is that she is actively, constantly trying to get out. She files the paperwork, she asks for help, but she just keeps hitting this massive bureaucratic wall, repeatedly being told she simply doesn't qualify for the available housing programs. Her story is absolute proof that just wanting to leave the streets and being willing to do the work isn't always enough to escape the cycle.
All right, Section 3, debating the root causes. Let's look at the clash of perspectives over why this persists.
On one side of the debate, you have fierce critics like local business owners who have watched the neighborhood transform for decades. Their argument is that the crisis is actually being enabled by the very organizations trying to help. They argue the abundance of free resources, food, and a lack of enforcement just creates this massive magnet effect. Plus, they point out a really dark administrative reality. Surrounding counties are frequently using Skid Row as a literal dumping ground, quietly dropping off their own homeless populations there because the infrastructure and the tolerance already exist.
But flip the script and you hear from the nonprofit organizations actually working on the front lines, like the Midnight Mission. When you ask them about the true root cause, they don't point to housing prices or free food. They point to human isolation. They argue that the fundamental, absolute core cause of homelessness is profound loneliness, a complete and utter disconnection from community, family, and a support system. Because when that human safety net snaps, the descent under the street is incredibly fast.
It's super crucial to frame these two polarized views so we can really grasp the full picture here. It's basically a massive tug-of-war. On one hand, the argument is that this is a crisis of enablement, driven by taxpayer money, a lack of strict rules, and the undeniable draw of California's warm weather. On the other hand, it's argued as a crisis of systemic failure, driven by a broken mental health apparatus, an impossible housing market, and severe human trauma. Our goal isn't to declare a winner, but to understand the complexity of the clash.
And honestly, regardless of which side of that debate you lean toward, everyone has to deal with the harsh reality of rampant, open drug use that severely complicates any path to a solution. We're talking about scenes that are hard to even fathom, like young people openly smoking crystal meth inside a luxury BMW, just parked right there on the street. It's an environment of almost total tolerance, to the point where individuals specifically travel across the country to Skid Row just because they know their addiction will go entirely unchecked by law enforcement. It just adds such an intense layer of volatility to the entire area.
Section 4, Inside the Relief Organizations. We're focusing in on the Midnight Mission.
1 million. That is the staggering number of meals served every single year by just this one organization, the Midnight Mission, operating right out there on Skid Row. It is a massive, massive logistical undertaking. Honestly, at times it resembles a feeding frenzy, just out of sheer desperation to keep people alive day by day.
But to say they just hand out sandwiches would be entirely inaccurate. They provide massive structural support to try and actually pull people out of the cycle. They operate 300 beds dedicated to a rigorous, year-long drug and alcohol recovery program. They run an education center teaching practical skills like Microsoft Office to help folks re-enter the workforce. They have dedicated family housing and a first-of-its-kind women's shelter in the area. And here's something wild. They often serve the near-homeless. These are individuals who actually have jobs in apartments, but the cost of living in California is just so punishing that they literally cannot afford groceries after paying their rent. Finally, Section 5, A Crisis Without End. Let's look forward.
The harsh, mathematical reality of the whole situation is this. Despite the billions of dollars spent, and despite the millions of meals served, the vast majority of daily movement is people falling into homelessness. That completely dwarfs the tiny fraction of those successfully navigating the system to get housed. The systemic safety nets are failing way faster than the recovery programs can catch people.
And this leads to a pretty sobering admission from the very people working on the front lines. Even those dedicating their entire lives to this recovery effort admit that a permanent, final solution might be totally out of reach. As one worker noted, the goal might not be to eradicate it forever. Human frailty and systemic cracks are always going to exist. But the absolute necessity is provide more services to just catch as many people as possible when they fall.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought to chew on long after this explainer ends. We began by looking at a $3 trillion economic powerhouse. The wealth is undeniably there. The resources exist. Yet, 50 blocks of extreme human suffering remain completely entrenched right in its center. So is it a matter of wildly mismanaged funds, broken political willpower, or are we looking at an unavoidable, permanent byproduct of our modern economic reality? I highly encourage you to keep questioning the structures around you. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.